Welcome to Village Connect. I'm Tom R., pastor of Village Church. This is what I love about this gospel, a read through the Gospel of Mark. In this session, I want you to read chapter 8, verse 22 through chapter 9, verse 1. A couple of stories that it's important to read together. So 8:22 through 9, verse 1. Read that. See what strikes you, and when you finish that, turn the video back on and we'll start the conversation. So in this conversation, we're looking at two passages from Mark's gospel. The first is the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida, and the second is where Jesus asked his followers, "Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" These stories, I've had you read them together because they interpret each other. The healing of the blind man is a fascinating story. It comes after Jesus has worked many miracles. He's cast out a legion of demons. He's stretched out a withered hand. He's raised a paralytic. Time and time again, Jesus has done deeds of power. Almost 25% of Mark's gospel are miracle stories, as we've said before. And in this one, Jesus comes to a blind man who wants to see, and he touches his eyes and asks him, "Can you see?" And he said, "Yes, but not clearly. I see men, but they look like trees walking around." It's kind of a funny moment. It's hard to know exactly what happens there, but Jesus touches his eyes again. There's a second touch, and this time he sees everything clearly. And then Jesus looks to his followers and says, "Who do people say that I am?" Well, they said, "Some say you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead, a prophet. Some say you're Elijah." Elijah was a prophet that was expected to return before God's final work of redemption. Some said, "No, you're the presence of Elijah among us." And then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter, he says, "I know who you are. You are the Christ." Now, to understand this, I want to remind us of the very first verse of Mark's gospel. Mark, you can take this first verse. In our day, it would have been the title of the book, I think. Mark begins his gospel by saying, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." That's who Jesus is. He's the Christ. That's a title. That's not a last name. He's Jesus the Christ, not Jesus Christ, son of Joe and Mary Christ. It's not that. It's a title. It is Christ is the Greek word. The Hebrew word is Messiah. The Messiah was the promised one of Judaism, God's promised leader. Mark is saying Jesus is that promised one, and Jesus is the Son of God. That's who. And then the rest of the gospel, Mark explains to us how he understands Jesus to be the Messiah and the Son of God. So when Peter says, "I know who you are. You're the Christ," he's half right. He is the Christ, the Messiah, but he's also the Son of God, and Peter doesn't see that yet. He's going to need a second touch. He sees Jesus rightly, but not clearly. He's going to need a second touch. And what will happen now for the rest of this gospel is we begin to focus on the cross. Jesus will, for the first time, mention that he will be crucified. He'll mention it right after this conversation. He'll mention it again in chapter 9. He'll mention it again in chapter 10. Up until this point, what Jesus' followers have seen is he is a man of power. He is a man who can work miracles. But it is clear that Mark says if we are going to understand who he is truly, we can't simply know him as one of power. We must know him as one who gives himself away for the salvation of the world. it'll take a second touch. So just like the blind man at Bethsaida that took 2 touches, Jesus' followers will need to continue to pay attention to who he is. Now, what does that mean for us today? I think it means that even when we see him, maybe we never see him as clearly as we can. So that's why we have these conversations. That's why we have these studies together. We continue to pay attention to him that we might see him more clearly and know him as the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God.